One of the things that I'm still getting used to, even though I've actually now been at DOE for a year, I had my anniversary 2 weeks ago, which I know about because on LinkedIn, it sends all of your contacts a notice that you're having a work anniversary. So all these people sent me congratulations on your work anniversary. So that's how I found out that I actually was having a work anniversary. So I've been here a year, so I don't have the excuse that I've actually used for a long time. You know, I'm new to the government. I don't actually know where things are. I mean, at this point, I really have to. I can't use that excuse anymore. I got to be all in. And I do say that many of you know I do struggle. That I now represent DOE, so I speak for DOE. So I have to can't always say quite as much as I would like. So don't tempt me with questions. So the first part of the presentation is DOE's role in the President's Climate Action Plan. I think many of you know about this. I'm going to kind of go through really quickly so that you can have the opportunity to ask me questions, most of which I'll be able to answer. And so I'm going to talk about the President's Climate Action Plan, mitigation, climate resilience, and the QER. And the President's Climate Action Plan, many of you know, was launched in June 2013. It's got 3 basic pillars: cutting carbon pollution in America, preparing the U.S. for the worsening impacts of climate change, and engaging internationally. Some examples, I'm going to focus more on the mitigation. That's a little bit more of what you all work on. I'm going to talk a little bit about impacts work, and I'm not going to really cover international. And a lot of things that DOE is doing and the government is doing broadly have to do with the Climate Action Plan. So to some extent, some of this stuff is multi-purpose. We're working on a lot of things with renewables, with developing an interagency methane strategy, which I'll mention. And I think that a lot of the work that we do, efficiency standards, you can think about as the right thing to do from an energy perspective, but also has climate benefits. But we also are specifically focused as an administration on making sure we work on mitigating climate change. An interesting insight, which I'll repeat again later, is that the quadrennial energy review, which I'm going to talk about in the second part, is actually started under the CAP. It's actually part of the Climate Action Plan. So part of the Climate Action Plan is that we have to think broadly about our energy system. So it's not just about dealing with climate, but dealing with climate in the context of an energy system that works for everyone. I'm also very involved in the interagency methane strategy. The DOE's role in this is we've been less focused on coal, but I'd actually be interested if people have ideas about how we could do more on that front. This is part of the Climate Action Plan, and it said curbing emissions of methane is critical to our overall effort to address climate change. To achieve additional progress, the administration will develop a comprehensive methane strategy and pursue a collaborative approach with state governments as well as the private sector and cover all methane emitting sectors. And there's 3 pillars. We're big on pillars, I guess, in the administration: assessing current emissions data and addressing data gaps, identifying technologies and best practices for reducing emissions, and identifying existing authorities and incentive-based opportunities for reducing emissions. As many of you may know, we've been very involved. The Secretary convened a series of roundtables that were focused on the downstream and midstream part of the natural gas sector, and that's been a big focus of ours, at least at the moment. Certainly, the methane issue is much broader. It comes from all kinds of sources, including a lot of agricultural sources. We at DOE have been more focused, obviously, on the energy sector, and at least this year we've been mostly focused on the down and midstream part, because as I'll talk about later, that is the same boundaries as the quadrennial energy review. This year we're focusing on transmission, storage, and distribution. So we focused on the methane emissions from natural gas from that. So that's been our focus this year. Methane strategy is much broader. Possibly next year we'll get more into other issues, including, for example, coal on that context. Probably the biggest ticket item in the Climate Action Plan is the power plant rule that EPA proposed in June of this year. This is from the President's Climate Action Plan, and in particular, there was a presidential memo to EPA in light of the Climate Action Plan that specifically laid out a few things that I think are of particular interest to DOE. And basically, the memo that the President sent to EPA saying, you know, we need you to work on this rule, and then they proposed the rule just this past June, said that they need to maintain the continued provision of reliable and affordable electric power, allow the use of market-based instruments, performance standards, and other regulatory flexibilities, tailor regulations and guidelines to reduce cost, and enable continued reliance on a range of energy sources and technologies. And if you sort of look at that part, you sort of see that there's a lot of energy in that. And so we at DOE are certainly concerned with all of these issues and are thinking actively and playing an active role in considering the rule and making sure that we can be helpful to states. So the process that the presidential memorandum laid out is that EPA was to launch their effort through the states, and you've all seen that's what they've been doing, and to work with Department of Energy, we're actually specifically called out, and other federal and state agencies. And so we have a role of providing the best technical information we have to all of the parties, including, of course, EPA, and to the states. And we have a particular interest in helping states and are now offering technical assistance to states who need it to explore the sort of energy system aspects of this rule, and particularly things like with energy efficiency, where we have a lot of expertise, for example, on how you actually measure energy efficiency. And of course, reliability. That's a key interest of ours. And again, we're very interested. We're starting to think a lot about that and very interested in other people's thoughts about how you actually think about reliability and make sure that it's addressed in the context of the Clean Power Plan. This is our website that we have recently stood up on state, local, and tribal technical assistance. This is much broader than the EPA rule, but it includes it. It's an all-of-the-above approach to technical assistance. Throughout DOE, there are offices that offer states technical assistance. We're now trying to make it easier for states to find the information that they need. Hopefully you can tell from the picture, it's everybody. It really is all of the above. This secretary, and actually this is true of me, in fact, was into all of the above before it was cool. And this is a secretary, and certainly the policy office really thinks you have to look at all of our energy resources and take best advantage of them. So we are looking to help folks. They don't have to necessarily go in through the individual offices, although they can get help that way. But also this is a portal so that if you have a broad question, you're not sure where to start, this is to sort of help state and local officials come in and get the assistance that they need on any kind of energy issue, including for that might be relevant to the Clean Power Plan. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about we have a lot of other work on mitigation, so I'm just trying to give you some highlights, but we're also doing a lot of work on resilience. It's interesting, the lingo is changing a bit. I have the guy who works for me who's on point on resilience says he used to work on adaptation and now he works on resilience because that's what people call it now. I don't know, somehow I guess the term polls better. And so this is about building stronger and safer communities and infrastructure, protecting our economy and natural resources, and using sound science to manage climate impacts. And this is a report that we put out last year. It's been over a year ago on U.S. energy sector vulnerabilities to climate change and extreme weather. Many of you may be familiar with it. And we're now in the process, and everything sort of takes longer in the government than I had hoped. We are now in the process of doing follow-on work on this, where we're looking at the vulnerabilities more in a more regional and fine-grained context, so looking region by region and in more detail on what we can learn about vulnerabilities, and we're also looking more at solutions. So we're very interested in what it is that folks can do in the energy sector to become more resilient. And this feeds into a number of different processes. There's actually a state and local task force that's looking at resilience that reports into the administration White House process. And there's also an interagency climate resilience council. And my boss, Melanie Kenderdine, co-chairs the infrastructure piece of that resilience council. So there's lots of places this fits in. It also fits in the quadrennial energy review, which is also looking at resilience questions. And if you're familiar with the report, this will be a little boring, but for those of you who are interested, if you take a look at the report, there's a lot of interesting anecdotal information. Mostly, we don't have a great comprehensive view of all of the issues that are occurring, but certainly the energy sector has vulnerability to climate conditions. And this is something that we're looking at, whether it's low water levels that reduce hydropower, or wildfires damaging transmission lines, or flooding issues in different parts of the country, lower river levels that can affect barges, cooling water intake or discharge that's too hot. There's all kinds of issues that the energy sector itself has to worry about in terms of climate and extreme weather, and particularly in light of climate change. And that's what the report talks about. And then It also starts to get a little bit into solutions, and this is where we want to do more work, and it would definitely welcome input on this about what it is that one actually can do to become more climate resilient. What kinds of investments can you make to make your systems more flexible, more resilient, to be able to withstand storms? Can be anything from just hardening infrastructure to a better use of demand response to making your various processes using wastewater, for example, instead of clean water. There are ways that you can deal with your water availability. Water availability can be an important constraint for power systems, and using different sort of non-traditional water supplies is what they refer to. So that's kind of what we're up to broadly on the Climate Action Plan. I'm happy to answer questions about that. And then sort of segueing into my next presentation, which hopefully someone can find, is the Quadrennial Energy Review is a big focus of our office, the Energy Policy and Systems Analysis. And this is something that President Obama initiated in January of last year. The first installment is due in January this year, so we're really crunching on that, and I'll get into that a little bit. And the idea is to take a really comprehensive view at our energy system and make sure that it's meeting all of the goals that we have. And it's government-wide. It's not just DOE. DOE is called the Secretariat for the Quadrennial Energy Review, but the work is actually being done across the federal government, and we have a big job actually just to coordinate that process. It's being coordinated out of the White House, and we are sort of staffing that whole process. But it's really, since energy, as many of you know, is really not just a DOE issue. Energy is dealt with in all parts of the federal government. So it really is an administration-wide effort to develop a comprehensive view of what we can do on energy. So how do I pull up the next one? I'll just wait. Okay, so while that's coming up, I'll just tell you a little bit about coal and the QER. The Quadrennial Energy Review, we've kind of changed the meaning of the word quadrennial. So we're not doing a study every 4 years, which is what I had initially thought quadrennial meant, and in fact, that's generally what it means. But what we're doing is we're basically doing a quadrennial energy review, but in 4 parts. So every year we'll produce some piece. The piece for this year is energy infrastructure for transmission, storage, and distribution. And so given that context, where does coal fit into that? And I would say that for QER, what we're calling 1.1, because the next year will be 1.2, I would say there's more equities for coal likely in future quadrennial energy reviews than in this one. It's will not be considering things like safety, environmental performance, productivity, and so on the coal power plants or coal production. That's sort of not in scope this year. So I think a lot of the issues or the pros and cons of coal utilization technology, so I think a lot of the issues that you deal with are more likely to be in future increments of the QER. So I think that this is, in a way, to make virtue out of necessity. I think you all might be actually lucky, because this year, while we've been starting up our office and doing the first QR, we've been very rushed. And I think that next year we'll have more time. And I think you all might already want to start thinking about how you can feed into future QERs that will take on other parts of the energy system. So the things that are in scope this year that you might be interested in is with the increase in crude oil by train, that's actually causing rail system effects, which may have and actually are having effects on you all. And I think that that is something that will be, and I know that that will be something we'll talk about in the QER. What's happening to the railroads as oil by rail? How does that compete with other things that move by rail, and what does that mean for our system? So we will be talking. We've been doing some analytical work on that, and we will be talking about that in the QER. There's particularly an example, as I understand it, that there were coal-fired power plants in Wisconsin and elsewhere had trouble getting the coal that they needed because of rail constraints. So I think that I know that those issues will come up. We're also looking into what are the plans of the private sector to address freight rail capacity. So again, that's in scope 2. The Surface Transportation Board recently required railroads to report on a weekly basis on the speed of deliveries of coal and other commodities. Will this produce positive results for utilities? What other levers exist for federal and state governments to assist in addressing these capacity, service, and reliability concerns? So that's all part of what we're doing. Again, not sort of the main thing like clean power, how you make coal cleaner, all those kind of things. That's really not this year. I should also mention a couple other things that are in scope. There's a lot more crude moving by barge than we've seen before, and also that's potentially got issues for coal. And is that, again, displacing coal, and what does that mean for example, power plants in the Southeast? And we're also interested in what the movement of all that coal and crude on the inland waterways does to regard to the age, maintenance, and refurbishment and replacement of the nation's 200 some odd locks and dams. I've actually been learning some about locks and dams, and apparently a lot of the locks that we have are still hand cranked. There's just a lot of old infrastructure in that world, which I didn't know about. We're also looking into port facilities and associated infrastructure, and looking at what implications that might have, and what is also competition potentially for LNG, all the different ways that the whole energy system moves energy around, and what might that mean for coal as well. We're also looking at the status of CO2 EOR pipeline infrastructure. That might be a way that we back in a little bit into some of these issues, but that is something that we're looking at as well in the context of this QER. And we're also looking at air emissions at ports and rail yards, which again may have some implications for coal. So can anyone read this slide? Yes, okay. So we have this habit in the QER of making slides that I think are too busy. So this is why I couldn't merge the other ones. I've sort of lost half the information when we tried to merge. So this is basically the story of what we're doing in the QER. We're trying to look at minimal environmental footprint, affordability, flexibility, safety, robustness, and scalability. Sort of how do you get an energy system with all those attributes? What is it? How close are we? What do we need to do to get there? This is the QER schedule. So we are in this October place. I can't figure out how to use the pointer. And this is where we're just bringing all of this work together. Because we only just got started as an office about a year ago, and we only started the QER in January, and so lots of things were happening at once. We're doing a lot of things in parallel. We're doing synthesis analysis. We're doing white paper and technical papers, scenarios and modeling. We've got a bunch of working papers in train. I actually had a deadline for a working paper yesterday, so that's why things were a little nuts for me. So there's just all of this analysis that's coming in and being synthesized. And of course, we've had a lot of stakeholder input. We've had 14 meetings, which I'll show a slide on, around the country, getting input from stakeholders. Hopefully you all are aware that the deadline for comments was Friday, although I imagine we'd welcome input from you if we can get it as soon as possible. And so the entire process now is we're synthesizing, we're analyzing, we're doing scenarios. We're also working with other agencies to make sure that the entire federal government equities are taken into account. And then the idea is to get most of that work done in terms of an actual report, and then it goes through interagency review process, which, as you know, can take quite a bit of time. So, working papers. Okay, so this is a little bit about how we're thinking. There's the electricity, natural gas, and liquid fuels is kind of the categories that we've been talking about, but of course there's lots of cross-cutting. I tend to do a lot of cross-cutting work because climate is cross-cutting. We're doing a lot of work on interdependencies, like gas-electric interdependency is something that we're looking at, energy transport infrastructure interdependencies, like I mentioned earlier, land use and siting, and then issues like, for example, conventional air pollution from stationary TS&D sources, and also, as I mentioned, methane and some of the other things that we talked about. So there's a particular paper, I don't know if I can figure out how to show it, but there's an oil by rail safety paper, and there's also coal by rail, but I guess that isn't shown on this slide. So I think there's a lot that we're doing that impinges on you, but again, it's not the central kinds of issues that we generally think about for coal. And, here's the coal by rail paper is under liquid fuels for some bizarre reason. And so there's, as you can see, a ton of stuff. A lot of our work is going to be synthesis, and we will definitely need, we'll be taking into account stakeholder input as much as we can get it. This is a potentially interesting example for what we're looking at with the pipeline, rail, barge, and intermodal issues. And this is, again, an area that you all might be interested in, and you kind of see the beginning of what the effects, the sort of key cause that all of these other things are kind of trying to adjust to is this incredible increase in oil by rail. And we're sort of looking quite deeply. I think this is something everybody's noticing, but we're trying to look really deeply in what the impacts of that are, sort of for the energy system as a whole. And this is another example, not specific to coal, but of the kinds of vulnerabilities that we're looking at: hurricanes and flooding, disruptions of crude imports potentially. And let's see, and this is a list of our public engagement meetings. Hopefully you all have been participating, but if not, let me know and we'll figure out if there's input that you want to provide, we'll get it in somehow. So we did have these 14 meetings around the country, and this is really supposed to be, and we will make sure that it is a process that's inclusive, that makes sure that we take into account a range of views within the government as well as outside the government.